You may have noticed that we've spent a lot of time talking about how to identify the specific skills that a given child might lack. We haven't spent much time at all, actually, talking about how to identify the chronic problems to be solved that precipitate the challenging behavior. And you'll remember that I spoke this morning about the fact that it takes two to tango. It takes the pairing of a skills deficit with some demand that would require that skill to set off the challenging behavior. So, before we're actually ready to intervene, we really need one more crucial piece of information. The piece of information that we need is the situations in which the challenging child routinely tends to have the most difficulty. These are things that you might call the precipitants, the situations, the context, the demands, the expectations, the setting events, the triggers, if you will. All of those are different ways of describing what we call the problems to be solved. Under this big heading of problems to be solved are all those things that set the stage for the challenging behavior. Now, the interesting thing is they tend to be highly predictable. So, for example, if I mentioned 10 of the most common problems to be solved in homes across North America, we probably would capture 90% of the challenging behavior that occurs. If we said things like getting up in the morning and out the door to school on time, the amount of screen time of some type that a child uses is on. You know, we're talking computer, games, TV, etc. Homework, sibling interactions, food and meal choice, curfew, going to bed, hygiene. We're capturing the vast majority of challenges that occur. Now, just as we talked about with lagging skills in the morning, once you identify a category like that, the goal is to get a whole lot more specific. So while these things are very predictable, in schools it might be things like circle time, recess, gym, lining up, transition from one thing to the next, writing tasks, you name it. While we can quickly find a major category of predictable problems, one of the goals is to get much more specific. Now, sometimes people get a bit confused about the difference between what we're calling a problem to be solved versus what we talked about earlier, the skills to be trained. So let me clarify that. The problem to be solved is the demand placed upon the child that they are having a hard time handling. The lagging skill is the reason why they're having a hard time handling that. So for instance, the demand would be the expectation that they come in quickly from recess. And if they do not meet that demand effectively, then the lagging skill, likely difficulty shifting gears in this case, would be the reason why. So what you're on the lookout for is not only the skills to be trained, but the predictable problems or precipitants that set the whole ball rolling in the first place. And in essence, you're just trying to create those two lists. Why do we want a list of predictable problems to be solved? Because the reality is that you can't prevent unless you can predict. And one of the major indictments of most behavior management approaches is that they're almost entirely reactive. What do you do once the meltdown has occurred, the maladaptive behavior? And if these problems are highly predictable and you can create a list of when they happen, it allows you to do some pretty important things. First of all, you can anticipate them before they happen. You can then prioritize how you want to handle them and what you want to work on first, and you can shift from being in reactive mode to being proactive. And in this approach in particular, that's critical. And you cannot be proactive unless you have a good list of predictable problems to be solved. So boiling down assessment in this approach, assessment really is just creating two lists. A list of problems to be solved and a list of skills to be trained. Now, the major point I want to drive home with your list of problems to be solved is the more specific, the better. Now, why is it better to be more specific? Because the more specific your list of problems are, the more they'll serve as useful clues to identify what skills a child lacks. If I gave you broad categories of types of problems a kid has, it wouldn't give you a lot of information to suggest what skills the child struggles with. But the more specific I am, the more it'll lead you to where the skills deficits are. And I'll illustrate that in just a moment. The other thing, though, is the more specific the problem is defined, more specifically it's defined, the easier it is going to be to start a problem-solving discussion about that problem. If it's a big general category, it's going to be hard to get a collaborative problem-solving discussion off the ground. So those are two reasons you want to be highly specific, and we're going to demonstrate that in just a sec. Now, earlier we worked on figuring out what skills a child lacks. Well, the interesting thing about that is in the beginning, we don't even encourage people to obsess too much about what skills a kid lacks, because in the beginning, you don't even need to necessarily be right about it. You just have to be thinking in the right ballpark, in other words, because it's the knowledge of the potential lagging skills that the kid struggles with that helps people embrace the mindset that if the child could do well, he would do well. This is a deficit of skill, not will. So in the beginning, we're really using that list of lagging skills to promote a much more humane, compassionate view of the child, to position the adults to be helpful. But where are people going to start working? They're actually going to start working on the problems to be solved, which is why we actually tell people in the beginning, pour more time and energy into figuring out your list of problems to be solved than your list of skills to be trained. Your list of skills to be trained can just be your hypotheses for now. Now, while I just a moment ago clarified the difference between a problem to be solved and a skill to be trained, believe me that when you leave here later, that distinction will get murky again. And when it does, return to this slide, which is a little table that helps explain the difference. So what are they? The problems to be solved, as I've just mentioned, are your antecedents, your precipitants, your triggers. Your lagging skills are the culprits behind those problems. In other words, you wouldn't have those things wouldn't be precipitants or triggers if not for lagging skills. How do you assess them? We're just about to practice figuring out what your list of problems to be solved looks like. But basically, in a nutshell, you're doing what's called a situational analysis, which is just a fancy way of saying you're asking who, what, when, and where. With whom is this happening? When is this happening? Where is this happening? Over what is this happening? Notice which question I haven't asked, though, which is what? Why is this happening? The why is this happening are where the lagging skills are found. And you all have the thinking skill reference in front of you. That's the long list of the lagging skills we went over this morning. And so what we encourage people to do is do your situational analysis, come up with your list of problems to be solved, and then hypothesize about what skills a kid might lack. Now, the big why question is so what? Why do you care? Why are you creating these two lists? Again, your list of problems to be solved is created because that's where you're going to start working with the child. That's where you're going to start intervening. Your list of lagging skills, skills to be trained, is there in the beginning, mostly to foster compassion and understanding. So back to this issue of how do you create a list of problems to be solved that is specific enough. It requires the process of what we call drilling down to get as specific as possible. I like to tell people a good litmus test is imagine starting a conversation with the child aimed at solving that problem using what you've determined is the problem to be solved and see if you can imagine that conversation getting going. And if you can't, one reason might be that it's too general or too vague. So let me give you some examples. If you were to ask a family, for instance, tell me what the triggers or the problems that you routinely have. When does this happen? Where does it happen? With whom? They might say, with his sister. Now you might be inclined to write sister down on your list of problems to be solved. But if you stop there, here's what it would look like when you sat down and tried to solve that problem. Hey, I've heard things are pretty rough with your sister. What's going on with that? And you would probably hear how miserable sister is. But beyond that, it probably wouldn't get a lot of momentum towards problem solving. Nor, by the way, do we have any idea what skills the child might have. However, if you said, so sister, what do you mean? Well, they get into it all the time. Can you give me a specific example? Oh, it could be over anything. Well, pick anything, but just give me an example of a brother-sister altercation. Well, anytime she interrupts his Xbox play. Anytime she interrupts, how does she interrupt it? Well, if he's down there playing and pauses it to go get snacks or something and comes back and she's flipped Dora on in the meantime, he goes ballistic. Aha, interesting. Now that is highly specific. That goes on your list. And look at the difference. Imagine if you started out a conversation. Hey, I've heard that when you're in the middle of playing something on the Xbox, and your sister changes the channel, or she wants to use the TV, that can be pretty frustrating, can't it? I can imagine that conversation beginning to get some legs and have some possibility of working out in terms of a good problem-solving discussion. But beyond that, the other thing it does is it gives me some clues. If you look up and down your thinking skill reference, you can start to have some hypotheses about why somebody who has their Xbox play interrupted might erupt more likely than another kid. Now they might say, well, let's see, what else? The word no. That's a trigger. Whenever you hear that, you always need to say that deserves more specificity. What do you mean the word no? Well, anytime you say no to him, give me an example. And what we have to remember is it's not like we adults walk around just saying no all the time. We say no in response to certain things and requests. That's what needs to go on your list. Always constantly asking for food all throughout the course of the day. Aha. So no doesn't go on the list. Constantly asking for food goes on the list. Well, whenever something doesn't go his way, or whenever he doesn't get something that he wants, same thing. What you're going to say is, can you give me some examples? Drill down. Okay? Same thing in a school, by the way. Here's an example of a typical list of problems to be solved in a school when people are first doing this and they haven't drilled down enough. People might say, okay, the list of triggers and problems to be solved. Unstructured time, when he's with his peers, and when it's time to get down to work. Now what's the problem with that list?
So vague.
It's what?
So vague.
It's vague, and in fact it covers every moment of every waking hour at school, right? Because you're either with your peers in unstructured time or asked to get down to work, by and large, right? So the point is each of those is a starting point, but you need to get more specific. Unstructured time, what do you mean? With peers, what do you mean? Academic, oh, well, it could be anything. You'll hear this a lot. And resist the temptation, because unlike what we think about these kids, they're actually highly predictable. And stories make things come alive. Okay, if you can get somebody to tell you a story, which is why I find it is always easier to start by identifying your problems to be solved first, and then work backwards. So say, if the teacher were to say, well, he's like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You never know when he's gonna flip into this mode. You never know. Well, give me an example of when he did. Well, he'll outright refuse to do a task. Well, what kind of a task? Oh, it could be anything. Well, just pick an example. Well, the other day we were doing something fun and he refuses to do it. Like what? Well, we were starting our estimation unit. And people were supposed to guess how many M&Ms were in the jar. And he refused. Now, instead of refusal to follow teacher's directions, on your list of problems to be solved is refusing to do estimation task with M&Ms. I know that seems highly specific, but that's how specific you want it. Because what would you guess, by the way, if somebody refuses to do an estimation task, what area of lagging skill they might struggle with? Cognitive flexibility. And in fact, lo and behold, what did this kid say? They said, you're supposed to guess how many are in there. Why? Well, because we're practicing estimation. That's stupid. He's being disrespectful. Now you gotta be careful because you don't want disrespectful on your list of problems to be solved. What do you mean he was being well, he refused to do it. Well, what did he say? He said, that's stupid, I can tell you exactly how many are in there. Well, I know you can tell me how many exactly are in there, but that's not the point. The point is to estimate it. Why would you estimate when you can be sure? And pretty soon he's trying to wrestle the thing away from the teacher and spill it so he can count it. And what does that tell you? That tells you it's probably pointing back towards cognitive flexibility in this case. So the point is get a story, extract the problem to be solved, and then hypothesize about the lagging skills, remembering that behind most challenging behavior is not only some kind of trigger, but likely some kind of lagging skill there as well. Okay? So what we're really trying to do is we're trying to get away from behavior. How did he show you he was disrespectful? That doesn't really matter particularly to us. What matters is what was the problem to be solved? What was the demand, the expectation, the precipitant, and what skills would he have needed to handle that situation better? Because evidently he must be lacking those skills. And how do we know he's lacking them? Because kids do well if they can. Why refuse to do an estimation task if you have the skills to handle that well? Now, as I mentioned just a moment ago, if you create a good list of problems to be solved and a good list of skills to be trained, you'll find something interesting. Challenging behavior is a whole lot more predictable than we think it is. A whole lot more predictable. I encourage people to get to the point where they are no longer surprised by a meltdown, because either it's already on their list of precipitants, or it isn't, but you're not surprised that it's now going on the list because it would have required skills